up, guys? So today we're moving on in lesson 7.2, and we're going to be talking about the properties of different quadrilaterals. Okay, quadrilaterals, remember, are shapes with four sides. So we're going to be looking at different properties of these various different quadrilaterals to show you some different things that are going to happen within these that'll help you to solve problems in the future and to help you recognize exactly what that shape is. So let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is a parallelogram. So the key thing you need to know about a parallelogram is the word parallel, okay? So with a parallelogram, the opposite sides are going to be parallel to each other. So what that means is that this line is going to be parallel to this one, and then this line right here is going to be parallel to this one. So the opposite sides are going to be parallel to each other. Also on a parallelogram, the opposite sides are going to be congruent. So that means this side is going to be congruent to this side. That's why I'm putting the one notch. And then this side over here is going to be congruent to this side. So again, parallelogram, both sides are parallel, opposite of each other, and the opposite sides are also congruent to each other as well, okay? Last thing on a parallelogram are the opposite angles are also congruent. So that means this angle right here, if I go to the opposite side over here, is going to be congruent to this one. That's why I'm putting the one notch there, okay? And then lastly, this angle right here is going to be congruent to this angle right here. So again, parallel sides, congruent sides, congruent angles across from each other. So ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a parallelogram, okay? So let's jump into the next one. All right, guys, so the next thing we're gonna look at is a rectangle. So just so you guys know, everything that happened on the parallelogram is gonna be the same exact thing with the rectangle. So what that means is opposite sides are going to be parallel to each other because this is a parallelogram, okay? Opposite sides are going to be congruent to each other, which means this side's congruent to this one, and then this side right here is congruent to this side over here. Opposite sides are congruent, okay? The opposite angles are going to be congruent, but the only difference between a parallelogram and a rectangle is all of the angles are going to be 90 degrees. So 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and 90 degrees. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the relationship of a rectangle. So everything parallelogram, but the only thing is all the angles are going to be 90 degrees. So that's a rectangle, okay? Let's jump over to a square. All right, so the next thing we're gonna look at is a square. So basically a square is a parallelogram, is a rectangle, but it's also something else that we're gonna learn here in a second. It's all of these three shapes combined. So again, it's a parallelogram, which means this is parallel to this one, okay? This side is parallel to this side. It also means that this side is congruent to this side, but the thing that makes it different from a rectangle is all the sides are congruent because it's a square. So that makes it a rhombus as well. So that means this side is congruent to this side as well. And the reason why it's also a rectangle is because all of the angles are going to be congruent, or all the angles are going to be 90 degrees. That's why it's a rectangle. So it's actually a combination of a rectangle, a parallelogram, and a square. So all those are combined, a parallelogram, a rhombus, and a rectangle all combined to make a square, because all of that stuff is true whenever you're talking about a square, okay? All right, let's jump over to a rhombus. All right, so now looking at a rhombus is everything that a parallelogram is. So that means the opposite sides are parallel, but and then the opposite angles are congruent. So this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle right here is congruent to that angle. But the only difference between a rhombus and a parallelogram is that all of the sides are congruent. So basically a rhombus is a parallelogram where all of the sides are going to be congruent to each other. So that makes a rhombus, ladies and gentlemen, okay? So everything a parallelogram, all the sides are congruent, makes a rhombus, okay? Let's jump over to a kite. All right, guys, so looking at a kite, so again, looks like a kite that you would fly, but the reason or how you can recognize what a kite is that two pairs of adjacent sides are congruent to each other. So what that means is these two smaller legs are congruent to each other, and these two longer legs here are congruent to each other, which means those are congruent, okay? But then the ones next to each other right here are not congruent. So that means if these two lines were congruent with these two lines, it couldn't be a kite. So that means I have to have one pair congruent and a separate pair congruent to each other that are adjacent to each other, and that makes a kite, okay? And the last thing you need to know about a kite is that these two angles that are formed by these pairs are going to be congruent. So this angle right here is going to be congruent to this angle right here, okay? So ladies and gentlemen, these are the characteristics of a kite. Again, two pairs of adjacent sides congruent to each other, okay? All right, let's jump over to a trapezoid. All right, in this instance, when we're talking about just a trapezoid is clarified as one pair of opposite sides that are congruent. So that means if this top line and this bottom line, not congruent, are parallel, one pair of opposite sides are parallel, this makes a trapezoid. Okay, so this is basically the definition of a trapezoid, where these two lines are parallel, but these two lines over here are not. But now, if these two lines over here were congruent, that means this line was congruent to this one, then that would make it an isosceles trapezoid, which gives it more clarification here, which then means that this angle down here is congruent to this angle down here, and this angle up here would be congruent to this angle up here, okay? So ladies and gentlemen, this is the definition of a trapezoid. If these two lines are congruent to each other, then that makes it an isosceles trapezoid. So make sure everything that I'm saying, guys, you're writing all these definitions underneath here, and you're making it to where you understand fully exactly what these shapes are. All right, so let's look at example number 1. So on example number 1, it says we have a parallelogram, so it's automatically telling us what this shape is. It's shown below. We need to find the value of A and B. Well, I know in a parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel, but also opposite sides are congruent. So that means this side's congruent to this side, and this side is congruent to this side. So if you look, the variable is in each one of those expressions. So I'm just going to set those expressions equal to each other and solve for by variable. So the first one, Ln and St are congruent. So I'm going to do 3b plus 2 is equal to 4b minus 2. So 3b plus 2 is equal to 4b minus 2. And I'm doing this because in a parallelogram, my opposite sides are congruent. So I'm going to subtract 3b on both sides. That's going to leave me with 2. That's going to leave me with b minus 2. And I'm going to add 2 on both sides. So what that means is b is going to be equal to 4. Okay? And now LS and NT are congruent because the opposite sides are congruent. So I'm going to set these two equal to each other and solve. So that means 5a plus 4 is going to be equal to 3a plus 8. I'm going to subtract 3a on both sides. That's going to leave me with 2a plus 4 equals 8. I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides. That's going to leave me with 2a equals 4. Then I'm going to divide by 2 on both sides. So that's going to leave me with a equals 2. So ladies and gentlemen, I set both of these expressions equal because opposite sides are congruent in a parallelogram. All right, guys, so for example number 2, they're giving us a parallelogram. So what I know in a parallelogram is that my opposite sides are parallel to each other. And then also the opposite angles are congruent to each other. So what that means is this angle and this angle is congruent, and this angle and this angle is congruent to each other. But the thing is, they're wanting me to find the value of S. So the first thing I have to do is I have to solve for X. But I know that these two angles right here are known as consecutive angles, which means they're like right next to each other and they're sharing the same line. So with that being said, I know that they're also going to be, since they are consecutive, they're going to be supplementary, which means they add up to 180 degrees. So that means S and R, if I add those together, so 3x plus 50, and then if I add 2x minus 10, that's all going to equal 180 degrees. So 3 and 2 give you 5, 50 minus 10 is going to give you 40. So I have to subtract 40 on both sides, which is going to give you 140. And then I'm going to divide by 5 on both sides, which is actually going to end up giving you, what, 22? So 140 divided by 5 is going to give you 28. So ladies and gentlemen, the x value is 28, but what it's asking for is it's asking for angle S. So I actually have to take x now and plug it in for x. So 3 times 28 plus 50. I have no clue what 3 times 28 is. So 84. And then 84 plus 50 is going to end up giving you 134 degrees. So ladies and gentlemen, angle S is 134 degrees. So now we're going to jump over to example number 3. All right, so now in example number 3, we're given a trapezoid ABCD as shown below. And what is the value of x? So right now, if you look here, we're actually given an isosceles trapezoid, which means I have one pair of parallel sides, and then the sides that are not parallel are actually congruent. So if you look, I have these 2 little notches right here telling me those are congruent. So literally, how I solve for x is both of these are equal. So that means 3x minus 3 is going to equal x plus 5. And all I have to do is solve for x. So I'm going to subtract x on both sides. 3 minus x gives me 2x. I'm going to add 3 on both sides, which is going to give me 8. And then all I have to do is divide by 2 on both sides. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. Needing the value of x, so x is 4. Done. Move over to example. All right, then lastly on example number 4, it says the angle measures for kite JKLM is shown. What is the measure of angle J and angle L? Well, I know since this is a kite that these 2 angles are going to be congruent to each other. So that means I could represent both of those by the same variable if I wanted to. So now, in our last lesson, we learned that all the angles of a quadrilateral, which that's what this is, 4 sides, 4 minus 2 is 2, 2 times 180 is 360. So all the angles of this guy are going to add up to 360 degrees. So that means 44 plus x plus 80 plus x is all going to add up to 360 degrees. Combine like terms, x and x gives you 2x. 80 plus 44 is going to give you 124. Subtract 124 on both sides. Is going to give you 236. And then I'm going to divide by 2 on both sides. Which 236 divided by 2 is going to end up giving you 118 degrees. So that means both J and L are both 118 degrees because in a kite, these 2 angles that are not across from each other right here are going to be congruent to each other. Let me know if you guys have any questions and if you have any concerns, and good luck on your skill check.